So I'm so delighted to welcome today's presenter. He has presented for our program in the past and always has been a fabulous guest speaker in very interesting topics on Chinese art history. Um, and so I am so delighted to welcome Dr. Kevin Greenwood back to our program this morning. He at Oberlin College is located in Ohio, so he is zooming in from Ohio for us today. So Dr. Kevin Greenwood is an art historian and curator specializing in the visual arts and architecture of East Asia. His tenure as the inaugural Joan Danford Curator of Asian Art at the Allen Memorial Art Museum, Oberlin College, has been marked by rejuvenation of the interpretation and educational use of the museum's extensive collection of Asian art, covering prehistory to the present. This has been realized through a multitude of diverse exhibitions, guest speakers, public lectures, significant acquisitions, and other initiatives. He also was telling us yesterday that they are doing long-term planning for an expansion project at the Allen Memorial Art Museum on the Oberlin College campus. Additionally, Dr. Greenwood has been instrumental in securing vital grants aimed at art conservation and promoting educational outreach at the Allen Memorial Art Museum. His current exhibition at the museum for spring includes Inspirations, Global Dialogue to the Arts, 8 Views, Place, Picture, and Poem in East Asia, Trickster Spirits, Demons, Foxes, and Tengu in Japanese folklore, and Shadows of Meaning, Echoes of Memory, works from the Zirinsky collection. So for more about Dr. Greenwood and the Allen Memorial Art Museum at Oberlin, there is a link at the bottom, and I'll also try to put it in the chat to the Asian art galleries at the Oberlin Museum. So thank you so much, Dr. Greenwood, for joining us. We're looking forward to this, so take it away.
Well,
Yes.
thank you. Thank you so much, Ling and Catherine, for organizing this talk and for really for keeping the First Saturday group thriving as a source for engagement with the great diversity of Chinese culture. I love all the programs that you've got coming up. And Happy New Year. I also really want to thank Dennis Lee. I don't know if he's on the talk today, but thank you, Dennis, for all your support through the years, wherever you are. It's great to be speaking with folks in Portland again. I hope you all find the topic of today's talk as fascinating as I do. When I was living in Portland, I was completing my doctoral dissertation on Qing imperial architecture and how it reflected Qing political ideology. As part of this research, I ran across the story of how a Tibetan Buddhist temple made by the Qing court was replicated and put on display in a World's Fair in the 1930s and then disassembled and kept in storage for decades at some college called Oberlin in Ohio. So when I got the job at Oberlin in 2014, I found, unfortunately, countless other, well, fortunately or unfortunately, countless other curatorial priorities that have kept me busy for the last decade. But the story of the Golden Temple was always kind of floating out there as a potential project, like the Great White Whale or something. I kept, kind of building up a folder about the topic, and only recently have finally had a chance to start to think about it. Um, when my friends at First Saturday reached out and asked me if I had any topics I'd like to present, I immediately thought of this one because I feel that, the idea of replicating architecture from East Asia, erecting it in the United States, and then maybe struggling a bit to figure out what to do with it, might resonate with the First Saturday group. And hopefully we can talk about that in the discussion part. Although I have to say that the story of the Lansu Chinese Garden has a much happier ending than that of the Golden Temple, as we will see. So today's talk is going to move through 3 sections and 3 historical periods. First, the Qing court of the late 18th century and how the original Golden Temple related to Qing imperialist ideology. Next, how the replication of the Golden Temple and almost accidental inclusion of it in the massive Chicago Century of Progress exhibition reflected America's growing global ambitions and conception of itself as an industrial and cultural power. So a different kind of imperialism, really. Finally, we'll look at how the dreams to install the temple at Oberlin College were never realized, in part due to the political climate of the 1950s. Which, of course, brings us to North Korean political rallies. All right, that's a bit of a stretch, but bear with me. These rallies in North Korea are probably the most extreme surviving example of a form of political expression that was much more common in the vocabulary of imperialism, the visual vocabulary of imperialism in earlier times. That is, the overwhelming theatrical impact of spectacle. The spectacle was a major feature of the visual culture of imperialism. I think we're familiar with the iconography of the political spectacle, whether from ancient Rome, recreated here in the 17th century, reimagining by an English printmaker, Basil Kent. Other great examples by Albrecht Dürer, the German printmaker, or more recently in a kind of reimagining of Roman political spectacle by the Nazis, for example, at Nuremberg, or in Albert Speer's architectural designs for Hitler. Today, we really only see such elaborate spectacles on a regular basis in Olympic opening ceremonies, where the host nation gets a chance to dramatically highlight their cultural and historical ideals and achievements. In my opinion, one of the most effective recent uses of political spectacle for a global audience was the amazing 2008 Beijing Olympics opening ceremony. If you've never seen it or barely remember it or whatever, please watch it on YouTube because it was really a pretty phenomenal exercise. But how can we think of these political spectacles as a form of visual expression? In the words of Guy Debord, the spectacle is the existing order's uninterrupted discourse about itself, its laudatory monologue. It is the self-portrait of power in the epoch of totalitarian management of the conditions of existence. Our first case study looking at spectacle as a form of imperial, self-laudatory discourse comes from China's Qing dynasty. I'm sure everyone here is familiar with it, but just to briefly highlight the period, it was, of course, China's last period of imperial rule, lasting into the 20th century, the strongest, the wealthiest, and most populous global state by the 18th century, really, in the world. Multicultural and international empire, various constituencies, and one of those constituencies, the Manchus, were actually the imperial rulers, right? They were not Han Chinese, the majority Han Chinese. They were a different ethnicity. The Qing court was no stranger to massive performative ritual spectacles like the contemporary ones we just noted. Quoting scholar Philippe Fauré, the notion of spectacle was essential to the Manchu enterprise. Massive processions were held not only in the imperial capital, but in other spaces of the empire through imperial regional tours to the south, very famously, that demonstrated Qing military might and organization. But beyond the impressive but temporary displays of power seen in performances and processions, in the Qing period, there were more permanent forms of spectacle found in vast architectural and landscape garden palaces used to convey the totality of Qing rule. Fauré again likens these spaces to stages for performance. Imperial landscapes serve conceptually as the changing background of a theater stage. In fact, this architectural form of spectacle produced by the Qing court had less in common with the large public processions and rallies common to recent authoritarian and totalitarian states, and more in common with the 19th and 20th century world's fairs and their descendants in the totalitarian vision of Walt Disney, in the creation of a kind of utopian fantasy space. These vast Qing dynasty theme parks were created unlike Disney's, were created for the private use of the emperor and special guests. And in them, they recapitulated the Qing ideology of imperial universalism, the idea that the emperor was the legitimate ruler of all of humanity. These imperial theme parks or palace gardens utilized spectacle, but expressed it with two related concepts that we're going to focus on today. The first is the idea of microcosm, the creation of curated but reduced scale representations of larger entities. Chinese scholars' gardens, like the Lanzu Garden in Portland, are an example. Curated, domesticated worlds that included the four elements of nature and the fifth element of culture. Qing imperial microcosms owed a debt to this, Chinese tradition, but expanded the concept really to epic proportions. The other aspect of spectacle at play in Qing imperial palace gardens is replication, reproducing faraway parts of the empire and beyond for the emperor's convenience, allowing him to embody his many roles and perhaps better appreciate the diversity of his empire, or at least demonstrate his dominance over it. The diversity that came from such a vast empire presented challenges for the ruling Manchu elite, namely how to rule the empire's varied multicultural constituencies. The emperor who did the most to articulate the strategy of such rule was the Qianlong emperor, who ruled for most of the 18th century. Here's this wonderful portrait of him at the age of 25, when his really inaugural portrait, done by the famous Chinese painter Giuseppe Castiglione. The wonderful history of that artist, a Jesuit working at the Qing court. The Qianlong Emperor expressed what I call the ideology of imperial universalism in words, particularly in large quantities of bad poetry, in art, in architecture, as we'll talk about, in ritual, all of these designed to legitimate the rule of the Manchu elite to their varied constituencies. In fact, he portrayed himself in art and in other ways as everything to everybody. So, for example, for the majority Han constituency, he was both the son of heaven, the legitimate ruler of the Chinese Empire, and used all the traditional symbolic modes of that role. Also, to the Han majority, he portrayed himself as a literatus, a master of the history of Chinese literary culture that was so much a part of the government bureaucracy and elite culture of the Han. But the Mongols were very, very important. In fact, the Mongols were always the greatest potential military threat to the Qing if they were able to kind of, reorganize themselves like they did under Genghis Khan. And so to the Mongols, he presented himself as the heir of Genghis, as the great Khan. And in fact, there were sort of family ties to Mongol, nobility through, I think, through his mother's side. And also related to the Mongols, but also to Tibet, uh, the emperor portrayed himself as a sort of enlightened Buddhist ruler, the wheel-turning king, a kind of Buddhist tradition of enlightened ruler. And this was to, in a sense, represent himself both to the Tibetan constituency, but also to the Mongols, many of whom were Tibetan Buddhist practitioners and respected the important lamas and dignitaries of Tibetan Buddhism. Now, one of the best known Qing palace gardens is often today called the Old Summer Palace, just outside of Beijing, more properly known as the Yuanmingyuan or Garden of Perfect Brightness. Now it's next to Beijing University in the kind of northwestern part of Beijing today. It was outside the walls back in the Qing period. However, that site is mostly in ruins today after burning and looting by the British and French forces in 1860 and then again in 1900. I'd love to talk about that site, and I have in the past, but today I want to talk about another Qing Palace garden, which is left more complete and is now fully restored by the Chinese government. The summer retreat or summer capital in the town called Chengde, located north of Beijing. And you see the little red star on the map. That's the location of Chengde, and you can see Beijing a little bit further south. Jingshi, it says there, but that was the name for Beijing back in the day. The location of Chengde, the summer retreat, was significant. It was beyond the Great Wall, demonstrating the Qing court's lack of fear of the northern tribal peoples that, had hassled, China for many centuries. And they had a lack of fear because they were northern tribal peoples. And they used the site as a place for diplomacy with the various group of Mongols who were hesitant to come to Beijing due to the risk of smallpox, to which they had little immunity. The Mongol peoples were critical imperial constituencies, as I mentioned, because of their potential military threat. Now, the site of the summer retreat is divided up into two large sections. The first is the mountain villa for escaping the summer heat, and the second is the 8 outer temples. Now, the mountain villa for escaping the summer heat, if I can quote Philippe Fauré again, he wrote, quote, "The summer capital formed a composite landscape that reproduced the map of the Manchu Empire. At Chengde, Qing monarchs contemplated their empire by observing a microcosmos that acted as a synecdoche for the entirety of their domains, a symbol of the whole domain. And at the mountain villa in the south is the palace district, a beautiful collection of palaces in a kind of a rustic mode, courtyard after courtyard and building after building, stretching out, connected with the beautiful walkways. Behind that, north of the Palace District, is the Garden District. So beautiful, Chinese scholars' gardens and other forms of gardens stretched out, many of them all over this space. In one case, there's a reproduction of the famous Lion Grove garden in Suzhou. And then finally, a little bit further north of that is the Prairie District. So this was this vast, plain, basically, where the Mongols could erect their tents and where the Qing court would gather, and they would have, demonstrations of archery and horsemanship and performances and hunting and, that kind of thing. And there was the Mulan hunting grounds, which were a little bit further away, but that was also a big part of the attraction in this space. But what I want to turn to is the 8 outer temples, which relates to our topic today. And this is where the concept of replication even more fully comes into play. I want to give a couple of examples at the site of the 8 outer temples before we get to the Golden Temple in the end. Let's begin with the Monastery of Universal Tranquility, Puningsi, built in 1755. From 1755 to 1758, the Qing took advantage of a civil war among the Dzungar, a Mongol tribe on the west, a very powerful tribe. They took advantage of that civil war to conquer Dzungaria, and it was honestly almost like a brutal genocide. They killed like 70 to 80% of the Dzungar population. The destruction of the Dzungars led to the Qing conquest of Outer Mongolia, Tibet, and the creation of the far western province of Xinjiang as a political administrative unit. So that's where the control of Xinjiang really began. And this temple was built to commemorate the war and the defeat, first to aid the war, with Buddhist, magic, basically, and then to celebrate the defeat of the Dzungar Khanate. This is it. It's a beautiful place. I visited in 2005. It's phenomenal. The whole site is just amazing everywhere there. But this was built as a replica, although maybe we should say inspired by, it's not a direct replica, of Samye Monastery in Tibet, which is one of the most important historical monasteries in Tibet, founded, according to legend, by Padmasambhava, the great Indian guru who came from India, and is founded in 779, according to tradition. Now, from the outside, it looks like a 5-story tower, but in the inside are 3 massive statues. The biggest central one, an image of the 1,000-armed Guanyin, carved out of wood, 93 feet tall. It's just amazing to be in the presence of that massive sculpture. The next temple, the Blessings and Longevity of Sumeru Temple, built in 1780 to commemorate a special visit by the 6th Panchen Lama. kind of equal to the Dalai Lama in respect at the time. And it was a replica of Tashilhunpo Monastery in Tibet, the seat of the Panchen Lama. So built for, a copy of his own temple built for this visit of the Panchen Lama in 1780. Sad end to that story, the Panchen Lama contracted smallpox and died during the visit. So it was a kind of a diplomatic crisis. Finally, we get to the temple that's really our focus, the Potala. So this was constructed to commemorate the emperor's mother's 80th birthday. The emperor was famously filial to his mother, demonstrating that great Confucian virtue, which of course had its political dimensions. It was also the emperor's 60th birthday, really big deal, in the cycle of life and all that. But also serendipitously, it's came to celebrate the return of this Mongol group from Russia who sort of escaped from Russia and came to China, a big portion of the Kalmuk or Turgut Mongols. And here it is, the Potala, which some of you may immediately recognize as a copy, a replica of the Dalai Lama's palace in Lhasa, Tibet, which was originally built in 1694, the Potala built in 1771. And let me just jump back real quickly. You notice the big red tower at the end. That is inside that big red tower is a courtyard. And inside that courtyard is our subject today, the famous Golden Temple. Um, a wonderful study of this and really a phenomenal book about Buddhist culture in the Qing court. Patricia Berger's Empire of Emptiness, written in 2003, really inspired my interest in this topic and all of my research. So really check that book out if you're interested. This wonderful painting, 10,000 Dharmas Return as One, created by various court painters, including a couple of Jesuits. And it shows a gathering. If we zoom in, this large gathering of people, and there inside the Golden Temple itself, on the left are the Turgut Mongol leaders. On the right, the Qianlong Emperor himself, of course, painted larger than everybody else, which was a tradition in court painting. Um, so the Torguts, they were, they came from the Volga River Valley. Conditions there were kind of rough, so a big part of the Mongol group left, wandered, across land, through all kinds of travails, made their way to the court, and just happened to show up at the time of this celebration. And to the emperor, this appearance of this faraway tribe of Mongols. Sort of reinforced the idea that the emperor was enlightened and wonderful and was attracting people from all over to come back to submit to his enlightened rule. Part of classical Chinese political thought. So if we look at the site again from the distance there, you can see peeking over the top of the red tower in the back is the golden roof that gives the Golden Temple its name. Here we can see it in a Google Earth image on the right. You can't see it when you're down walking your way up the mountain. You don't see it until you enter into that courtyard, conceal and reveal this amazing structure. There it is from the roof inside the courtyard, and here's a wonderful shot of it inside that central courtyard. In 1994, the mountain resort and the 8 outer temples were added to the UNESCO World Heritage Site list and have been totally restored by the Chinese government. You're going to see photos of what this looked like in 1930 in a moment. It's a disaster. They've done a marvelous job of fixing it up. Here's the interior, absolutely beautiful. This huge that's not a painting, that's actually a woven, a kusa tapestry in the background, images of the Buddhas of the three ages. And then this phenomenal coffered ceiling with this sculpture of a dragon chasing a pearl, and that big plaque up there with calligraphy written by the Qianlong Emperor that reads Wan Yuan Pu Ying, which means all causes and conditions respond to universal influences. And the universal influence here being both the Buddhist Dharma and the enlightened rule of the Qianlong Emperor that, people like the Turgut Mongols were responding to. So that was a brief overview of the sort of political environment that created the Wanfaguiyi Dian, that temple, that I'm going to call the Golden Temple. We're going to turn now to the next part of our talk, which is related to Chicago's Century of Progress exhibition in 1933 to 34. So, in the 19th and early 20th century, as the Qing court declined, the site of the Qing summer retreat slowly deteriorated. This photo of the Potala at Chengde was taken by a scientific expedition that visited the site in 1930. And you can see it's really, really dilapidated. In June 1930, Swedish explorer Sven Hedin at the upper left, with ethnographer Gustav Montell, explorer and botanist Georg Soderbohm, and the Chinese architect Liang Weihua, or W.H. Liang, came to Chengde. This was part of what was called the Sino-Swedish Expedition, a vast scientific and ethnographic survey of China led by Sven Hedin. This part of the expedition was bankrolled by Vincent Bendix, whose photograph is at the lower right, a Swedish-American inventor and wealthy industrialist based in Chicago. Hedin approached Bendix in 1929 to pitch a project to find two Chinese temples, ideally Tibetan Buddhist temples in China, that Hedin saw as great cultural monuments of humanity, but particularly at risk for loss. And the initial plan was to deconstruct two temples, ship one to Chicago to be erected at Lincoln Park in Chicago, the other to Stockholm to be erected there. They would also be filled with Chinese Tibetan Buddhist objects, which at the time were called Lamaist objects. They didn't use the term Tibetan Buddhism as much. Now, the initial impetus to preserve threatened works of architecture by taking them apart and shipping them to the United States was in a sense similar to the French monastery and abbey cloisters that were shipped over to make up the Met Cloisters Museum in New York, that were shipped to the U.S. in the 1900s. Later, the Temple of Dendur at the Met, right? That big Egyptian temple that's in that, if you've ever been to the Met, in this big, beautiful atrium. Or even like London Bridge shipped to Arizona in 1968, right? That kind of idea. But due to poor relations between the Chinese central government, led by Chiang Kai-shek, who supported the expedition, and regional warlords, the idea of removing existing temples was seen as, maybe problematic and replaced with a plan to make replicas. And the all dharmas returned to one hall, the Wanfaguiyi Hall, the Golden Temple, was selected for this project based on its status as an at-risk Tibetan Buddhist temple and its architectural reputation as just a gem of Chinese architecture. In 1930, when the group visited, the team found the temple in poor condition as recorded in these photos. Based on the complexity and the expense, as I mentioned, it was determined that making two replicas of the temple was just going to be too challenging. So they opted to produce one that would be sent to the bankroller, to Vincent Bendix in Chicago. Liang Weihua led a team to carefully survey and measure the original Golden Temple in order to construct the replica. During the winter of 1930-31, a team of 70 craftsmen in Beijing created an exact scale replica of the building, 70 feet wide on each side, 60 feet high, 28,000 individual components, 28 exterior columns, 12 interior columns, 25,000 gilded copper roof tiles. You notice it's a double roof. The exterior and interior were ornately painted, and all were resting on a 4-foot-high stone terrace that was constructed in the U.S., not in China. However, after all the components were shipped to Chicago in 1931, plans to erect it in Chicago's Lincoln Park were postponed indefinitely. So ultimately, the idea of preserving original Chinese architecture was replaced with a plan to replicate it, and the plan to make a replica proceeded without a clear idea of the ultimate purpose for the building, an issue that still plagues the project today. But by storing this replica of a temple in Chicago, it made the Golden Temple a convenient addition to yet another microcosm, right? Chicago's Century of Progress exhibition of 1933-34. So just to kind of give you a very brief overview of the age of great exhibitions, in the late 19th, early 20th century, a popular venue for conveying the visual vocabulary of empire through the interplay of spectacle, microcosm, and replication was the International Exhibition or World's Fair. The Great Exhibition in London, represented in this image here, was the first, establishing the template of showcasing industrial and cultural achievements within vast exhibition spaces. World's fairs functioned in part as microcosms of Western imperial power and progress. They often created carefully curated spaces where Western nations displayed their colonial possessions, technological advances, and cultural achievements, while simultaneously categorizing and ranking non-Western peoples and cultures through ethnographic exhibits and human displays. Here are the major fairs of the late 19th century with the U.S. fairs in yellow. You'll note that the last was held in Chicago, 1893, the World's Columbian Exposition. The subject of that wonderful book by Eric Larson, The Devil in the White City. If you haven't read it, it's a good book. The fairs served multiple functions. They were simultaneously trade shows, museums, amusement parks, in effect, democratizing the microcosm from what had been a more exclusive imperial purview, for example, in earlier times. However, they still acted in part as propaganda vehicles that reinforced European imperial hierarchies by presenting Western civilization as the pinnacle of human achievement. This imperialist microcosm was physically manifested in the organization of the exhibition spaces, where colonial pavilions and native villages were typically positioned on the periphery of the grounds, while host nation achievements occupied central, prominent positions, literally mapping imperial power relationships onto the fairgrounds themselves. Here, for example, in the foreground, you can see Japan's Phoenix Pavilion, which displayed Japanese art treasures from three historical periods. But in the background, you can see, the huge hall. As a rising imperial power, Japan used these fairs very effectively as propaganda tools, but again, you'll note the peripheral status of the building in relation to the main hall. In the early 20th century, these fairs expanded in number and scope, with the United States hosting major fairs in 1904, 1915, and another in Chicago in 1933, the Century of Progress International Exhibition, which is our focus today. At the same time the Golden Temple project was being undertaken in China by the Sino-Swedish expedition, plans for the Century of Progress exhibition were underway, so simultaneously. Designed as a celebration of the city's centennial, it was organized and held in 1933-34, while the country was still in the midst of the Great Depression, which lasted from 1929 to 1939. Built on an area of roughly 427 acres, the entire site was built on reclaimed land on the shore of Lake Michigan. It cost $37,500,000, which is roughly $850 million in today's dollars. Funding came from private sources, not government or city funds. And companies like General Motors and others sponsored large corporate pavilions as landmarks and as marketing efforts. The fair provided a utopian vision of progress stemming from technology and industry. While ostensibly focused on scientific advancement, the fair reflected America's growing global ambitions and conception of itself as an industrial and cultural power. Like earlier exhibitions, the Century of Progress created a microcosm through strategic organization of national pavilions, cultural exhibits, and technological displays that reflected global power dynamics of the 1930s. Like other World's Fairs, it compressed global diversity into a walkable space where visitors could experience a curated version of world cultures, technologies, and commerce, though notably with more emphasis on future progress and less on colonial holdings than in previous fairs. Reflecting, in a sense, America's emerging role as a modern industrial power rather than a traditional imperial power. The exposition came at a pivotal moment when the U.S. was transitioning from a nation that had historically been skeptical of European-style imperialism to one that would soon embrace its own forms of global influence, particularly after World War II. While not overtly imperialistic as the same way as earlier World's Fairs, the Century of Progress reflected and reinforced views of American exceptionalism that would later support U.S. global hegemony. The world outside the US appeared in the fair's microcosmic vision, represented in ways that most often reflected American views of these places. It reminds me of if you've ever been to Disneyland or Disney World and gone through It's a Small World after all, right? Which how it's still open, I have no idea because as you go through, it's like every ethnic stereotype from an American point of view of the world is represented by these little robot people. Anyway, I digress. Um, Europe in this microcosm was a place of quaint historic architecture, seen in sites like you see here, the Belgian Village, the streets of Paris, the Spanish Village, Old Heidelberg. However, an exoticized and orientalized vision of the cultures of Asia was presented in spaces like the Oriental Village, which was kind of Western Asia, the Middle East, Ottoman Empire, and the streets of Shanghai. In these spaces, the fair's central theme of technological and scientific progress masked underlying imperial and racial ideologies of the era and subtly reinforced colonial hierarchies. The Oriental Village and streets of Shanghai featured performers in traditional costumes, emphasizing what Americans viewed as the mysterious and ancient aspects of Asian cultures. Merchants sold stereotypical, Oriental souvenirs. Restaurants served Americanized versions of Chinese cuisine. The commodification of Chinese culture reflected broader patterns of cultural imperialism. The fair's treatment of Asian cultures also reflected growing American anxieties about Asian immigration and economic competition. These representations helped reinforce racist immigration policies of the period, such as the continuing Chinese Exclusion Act and the more recent Immigration Act of 1924 that excluded Asian people by presenting Asian cultures as fundamentally other and incompatible with American society. Chinese American communities tried to challenge these representations, but their influence was limited by the racial prejudice of the era and, of course, political marginalization. But the building that made the most impact of all of these microcosmic cultural replicas, based on reports and records of the exhibition, was in fact the full-scale reproduction of the Golden Temple, made by the Sino-Swedish expedition funded by Vincent Bendix. At the fair, it became known as the Bendix Lama Temple, or the Golden Temple of Jehol, another name for it, Chengde. And there's the little yellow circle shows you the location. Bendix had connections with the fair's organizers, and with the plan to erect the Golden Temple in Lincoln Park on hold, he offered it to the fair. Fair officials accepted it, and they articulated its inclusion in the fair about science, industry, and progress as an example of the advanced techniques of architectural replication, more so than as a cultural site. So that was the way they kind of fitted into their vision. A team of Chinese and American workers led by Guo Yanxi, seen here at the right, a Chinese architect educated in the US, worked to complete the project by September of 1932. It was situated a bit off the main drag, just south of the Field Museum, which is obviously still there, and Soldier Field. We zoom in a little bit, and right next to it, to the right, was the Japanese pavilion built by the Japanese government. So again, a little bit off the side of the main drag, a little bit marginalized. The colorful and ornate exterior and interior were a huge draw for crowds. People just absolutely loved it. Although I think most were attracted to the visual splendor and the unfamiliar exoticism of the religious art. An attempt was made to interpret and explain for visitors the basics of Tibetan Buddhist practice and symbolism in a glossy souvenir pamphlet written by ethnographer Gustav Montel, a member of the Sino-Swedish expedition. You can see that in the lower left. You could also buy Lama incense at the site. Ultimately, the Golden Temple was, for most American viewers, a visually spectacular but content-free. And this version made its way into popular culture, seen, for instance, as the backdrop to this 1933 advertisement for a Nash car. Two wonderful articles that I've depended on for this talk. Cole Roscom situating Chinese architecture within a century of progress, and Carrie Shepardson and Scott's conflicting politics and contesting borders. Please, there's a list of sources that we'll make available to you. Grab those, and you can read a whole lot more about these topics. One major intention of the exhibition planners was to highlight modern architecture, and most buildings constructed for the park followed Art Deco or style moderne architecture. These modernist designs projected American confidence and power during this period of economic crisis. The contrast between the fair's optimistic vision and the Depression-era reality outside its gates highlighted anxieties about America's emerging role as a global power. Interestingly, major figures in modern architecture were not invited to participate. People like Le Corbusier, or even the Chicago-based Saarinen and Frank Lloyd Wright. Designs were done by an architectural commission. However, pavilions from other nations were encouraged to present modern architecture with their own regional forms. One particularly successful example of a modern expression of a regional architectural idiom is found in the Japanese pavilion, sponsored by the Japanese imperial government at the time. And you'll note at the far right, as part of this complex, and as part of Japan's laudatory monologue, a large added pavilion at the complex presented Japan's industrial and infrastructural achievements in the new Japanese puppet state of Manchukuo that they conquered in northern China, which an area which included Cheongda, the source of the original Golden Temple that was right next door. Now, the Chinese government and the Republic of China initially sponsored a project to create an even more dramatic work of Chinese-inflected modern architecture, seen in this design for a Chinese pavilion. However, due primarily to the combination of internal strife in the Chinese government and the Japanese invasion of Manchuria on September 18th, 1931, 4 months after the Republican government agreed to participate in the fair, led to the withdrawal of Chinese government support in 1933. So, bit of a scramble. The final Chinese pavilion was 1/8 of the original proposed size, was sponsored by Chinese American donors, and in the end was much less impressive than what was intended. So these political factors led to the Golden Temple being the most prominent representation of China at the fair, despite the irony that Cole Roscom notes in the article that I mentioned a moment ago. Let me read it to you. As an American-funded, Han-Chinese constructed replica of a Tibetan Buddhist-inspired Manchu imperial complex, now located in Japanese-controlled territory, the temple belied any nativist notions of a singular idealized Chineseness that would have represented China at the fair. So an odd irony there. I think Roscom really nails it with that quote. So getting to kind of the coda of the talk here, the dreams for the Golden Temple, and I promise I think I'm maybe running a little over time, but dreams for the Golden Temple from 1940s to the present, which brings us to Oberlin College where I work. There's a lot in the Oberlin archives about this project, but a good synthesis was written by Professor Chinese years ago, Dale Johnson. Although the essay is unpublished, it's listed in the sources and it's available at the archives. The story actually begins with an important historical figure and 1906 Oberlin graduate, H.H. Kong, Kong Changxi, seen here as an Oberlin student in the photo at the left. Kong was the Minister of Finance for the Republic of China, probably the wealthiest wealthiest man in China in the period, and perhaps equally importantly, the husband of Song Ailing, one of the 3 Song sisters, the other 2 married to Chiang Kai-shek and Sun Yat-sen, and powerful political figures in their own right. There's a wonderful movie about them, came out a few years ago. Michelle Yeoh plays Song Qingling. In the 1930s, Kong proposed a Chinese building for Oberlin, a home for a proposed Far Eastern Studies department, and a symbol of the long connections between Oberlin and China through missionary activity and the Oberlin-Shanxi foundation, an educational foundation. Kong pledged $2,000 or $3,000 at the time, roughly $50,000 in today's dollars, for planning, and promised to secure further donations for this building. At the time, they were thinking of a modernist Chinese building. Kong worked to raise funds, but there was hesitation about the project in the college administration, of course, due to the Great Depression, which was going on at the time. Now, back to the Golden Temple. After the Century of Progress concluded, the Golden Temple was packed up, shipped to the New York World's Fair of 1939, and then after the fair, you know, broken down, put in crates, and warehoused in Flushing, Queens. Members of the Shanxi Association, of the Oberlin Shanxi Association, learned about the temple and expressed an interest in acquiring the temple for the building project at Oberlin. They reached out to Vincent Bendix, who had bankrolled the Golden Temple, and he actually came to campus. The Archaeological Trust of Chicago, who had title to the building, offered it to Oberlin for $1 on September 1st, 1943. Now, President Wilkins, the Oberlin College president at the time, was kind of reluctant about it and not committed to the project, but agreed to it under pressure from trustees and from the Oberlin Shanxi Foundation. He preferred to have a modern Chinese building and not, in his words, and I quote here, a temple of a debased form of religion that would be a repudiation of the efforts of Oberlin missionaries. So he was not on board with having a Tibetan Buddhist temple at Oberlin, which was sort of famously a religious institution in the beginning. The Board of Trustees voted to approve the project in July of 1943, and H.H. Kong donated $75,000, which in modern dollars is about $1,364,000. In 1943, 18 boxcars arrived in Oberlin with the parts of the Golden Temple, and they were stored in a local warehouse. A model of the temple accompanied the crates, and it was set up at the Allen Museum in the central sculpture court, as you can see in this photo. Discussions began about how to use the temple. Again, nobody had an idea exactly what to do with it. And the ideas included things like it could be the Center for Far Eastern Studies. It could be art department offices. It could be a gallery for the art museum. It could be offices for the Oberlin Shanxi Foundation. And in March of the next year, 1944, President Wilkins created 4 academic chairs in Far Eastern languages and literature, art, history, and religion, the foundation of the really wonderful East Asian program that we have here today. And in November, the Department of Far Eastern Studies was established. Just for fun, this is what that same spot looks like today at the Allen, where that model was. And you can see things are kind of very different today. A Jeffrey Gibson beadwork on the wall way in the distance. They're very colorful. And a bell, big Chinese bell, donated by H.H. Kong, which is another whole story. After considering a few other spots on campus, a final plan situated the temple in a space between the Allen and the First Hall Auditorium. And in October of 1944, a groundbreaking ceremony for the project occurred. Here is that space today. The checkerboard building kind of to the right, designed by Robert Venturi, wasn't added until 1977, so that space would have been empty. This is a large space at the time appropriate for the temple and the surrounding garden. And here's a quick and dirty Photoshop mock-up where I pop the temple, the Golden Temple, in there to give you a sense of what it might have been like, minus the garden that was planned. So this is a pretty dramatic architectural statement in rural Ohio. Let me tell you, I'm 5 minutes away from cornfields to all 4 directions. However, unfortunately, World War II delayed the project due to a lack of building materials. And then even after the war, construction was continually postponed. The costs continued to rise. In 1949, finally, Oberlin requests the Chicago Trust to release the college from the obligation to construct the temple. And H.H. Kong requests the return of his money, which was done in 1950. So the Golden Temple then was in the bardo, right? The sort of limbo state in Tibetan Buddhism from this point on. 1950, just to give you a couple of things. Harvard Yenching Institute expressed interest in the temple. Ownership was transferred to Harvard Yenching, but they refused to pay insurance fees, and they tried to back out in 1958. 1962, the first Kalmuk Buddhist temple of Freewood Acres, New Jersey. These were descendants of the Torgut Mongols, for whom the original temple was dedicated, living in the U.S. They requested the temple be given to them. They acquired the title in 1963, but in the end, they couldn't raise funds, enough funds to re-erect the temple. 1969, ownership passes to Indiana University, but the person spearheading that fundraising effort died. Then, in the 1970s, the University of Chicago mounts a campaign unsuccessfully. Groups from Chicago Chinatown try to pursue the temple, and the project leader fell ill. The project withered. Meanwhile, in Oberlin, look at that. The temple languished in storage, and eventually the warehouse itself deteriorated. 1982, local scrap dealers Paul Herring and Fred Fagan falsely claimed to represent Indiana University. They gained access to the temple, looted all the copper roof shingles, sold them for scrap, looted other painted wooden panels. Not until 1984, 2 years later, the theft was discovered during a visit by Max Wohler from the Ethnographical Museum in Stockholm, who, was kind of connected to the Sven Hedin Foundation. He discovered the theft and that the warehouse roof had collapsed the year before, exposing the remaining components. He finds out about the false claims and looting. He sues the looters successfully, gains title on behalf of the Sven Hedin Foundation, and ownership is transferred to them. The remaining pieces were shipped in 1985 and 1986 to Stockholm, where they languished. Ownership was later transferred to the newly created Golden Temple Foundation, with plans to rebuild the temple in Stockholm. The model and other of the things from the interior, the paintings and sculptures, ended up in the Museum of Ethnography in Stockholm. In 2023, the Golden Temple Foundation files for bankruptcy. A Swedish-Chinese buyer purchases the remains, ships them to China with plans to rebuild the temple there. And that is where the ill-fated story ends, going out with a bit of a whimper. And to bring this to a conclusion, in the end, the ill-fated Golden Temple project is remembered here at Oberlin by a handful of us as a fascinating moment in Oberlin history. In most of my discussions about the project, people tend to look back upon it wistfully, dreaming of what might have been, right? But I've come to take a kind of a different perspective. I wonder what the status of the temple might be today if it had been successfully erected in 1943. Think of the political significance. After the revolution in 1949 and the U.S. anti-communist sentiment throughout the 1950s, how would such a prominent Chinese building on campus have been received? What about today's political climate? How would an American-funded reproduction of a Qing Chinese temple exhibited at World's Fairs with their cultural imperialist associations fare today? The closest analog I can think of is the Welsheimer Johnson House, designed by Frank Lloyd Wright, that the museum manages. Until a very recent large donation, it was largely neglected, only open in the summers because the heating doesn't work. One can only imagine even more neglect if funding and attention had been divided between two historic and largely ceremonial buildings. So, I mentioned the sort of current political sentiment, not only sort of right-wing anti-Chinese sentiment, but also left-wing sentiment, about cultural imperialism and cultural appropriation, all those kinds of things, right? Might have been a pretty controversial building on campus. So in the end, I'm thinking about the fate of the Golden Temple at Oberlin, and I am reminded of the Chinese idiom, Yanzhi Fei Fu, right? Who's to say whether or not it's a blessing, what happened? And that is where I will conclude. And I'm so happy to take your questions. I'm going to stop sharing and turn things over to the team here. How'd I do on time? How bad? A little over.
No problem. We love hearing these talks, so no problem with running
Mm.
running a tad bit over. Um, Thank you so much, Dr. Greenwood, for this Gosh, informative talk, fascinating, and still with so many questions. I was almost thinking as you concluded, um, uh, this would be a great like alternative history fiction novel about what Oberlin would be like if this temple was on its campus,
Yeah.
kind of story. So a question from Suzanne is asking, is it even feasible to have the temple rebuilt anywhere? Um, if somebody wanted to rebuild it today from what's left. She said from one of the photos, it appears that there's very little left of the temple. So with what is left, could that be replicated, or would there have to be a whole bunch more redesigned? What do you think, Kevin?
I haven't seen a list of what survived and what kind of condition it's in. Um, I suspect, based on the conditions of storage, you can see in that photograph, all that wood could have been warped and, infected with termites or, who knows what kind of condition it's all in. I don't think that the buyer would have purchased it if it was a complete disaster, right? I mean, there must be enough there to make it seem feasible to kind of put it back together. Um, they there's amazing craftsmen working in China today, recreating traditional architecture. It might honestly be easier, cheaper, more efficient to just do it from scratch and instead of trying to save that temple. But again, I really don't personally know the condition of what was left over. But all the roof tiles were gone. A lot of the paintings, the painted panels were gone. A lot of the other things kind of disappeared.
Okay, great. Um, so this question kind of harkens back to something you mentioned in the first part of your talk, question by Gretchen. She says, fascinating talk. Um, so in the intro, there was mention of of Chinese prehistory. I understand one of the six cradles of civilization is located in China, somewhere in the area of Beijing. Has any work been done on it? Is it possible to visit this? So,
Well, I don't remember talking about Chinese prehistory, but
oh,
but
okay.
absolutely, China is one of the most ancient and really the most ancient continuous civilization in the world, right? I mean, you can trace the Chinese written language system in use today all the way back to the Shang Dynasty, right? 1,000 years BC. So, there's obviously great historicity to China. As far as cradles of civilization, I mean, you could consider the Shang and maybe some of its predecessors, certainly uh, some of the earliest urban, civilizations in the world. Absolutely, uh, yeah, I'm not an expert in Chinese archaeology by any means, but there's a lot
Mhm.
there.
Okay. Thanks so much.
Sure.
Um, Jeff Kinkley asked, regarding the 1933-34 exhibition in Shanghai, did any other notable Chinese from the Republic of China come and attend besides, and I'm going to butcher his name, Guao Yuanqi?
Yeah, so I just highlighted folks that were involved in the project. Um, as far as dignitaries from the Republic of China, I don't believe any of them visited. They were so tied up with the Japanese invasion at the time, right? I mean they had made their way down to Shanghai by that time. So the Republic of China really had a lot more on its plate to deal with than visiting one of these exhibitions. Um, yeah, so I kind of think that that was part of the problem, right? Was the political crisis in China at the time that, of course, led into World War II and then the Chinese Civil War after that.
Right, yeah, one has to remember the geopolitics and what's going on the world stage. I'm sure that was a fantastic exhibition, just even from the photos that you showed and the local folks and even folks around the United States who could go just probably found it fascinating. But yeah,
And
the
you know
international
what?
community would have found it difficult to travel during that period of time, given what's going on globally. Right.
And it was the depression as well,
And
right? So there's
right,
a lot of inhibiting factors. But you know, that kind of brings up a question of what these kinds of sites and I would say, you know, like the Lanzu Garden mean to you know, Asian American communities, Chinese American communities in the US, right? It has a very different kind of history. I was focused a little bit on the kind of the negative, right? The kind of imperialist associations of these, but obviously, you know, having that representation and that you know, elevation of this wonderful architectural tradition has a different meaning and you know, maybe more you know, more connections to the Chinese American community than I highlighted. And that's something that I think should be mentioned.
right. I found it fascinating to talk about how the the local Chinese community in Ohio or connected to Chicago anyway took an interest in trying to acquire this so that they could, either use it for their own purpose or replicate it as a part of their endeavors, and how those never really got off the ground, or despite best intentions, things happened and they never acquired it. Because I'm
The
sure
one
that it would have been fascinating had, let's say, the Chinese community in Chicago done something with it.
Yeah, yeah, and again, you know, just a product of the period. The one that I found the most kind of touching was the Kalmuk Buddhist community in New Jersey, right?
Mm.
The descendants of the Torgut Mongols, who you know were trying to get it, you know, as this part of their heritage, right? In a sense, connected to that their history. So that would have been wonderful if they could have pulled that off. But I imagine it was, you know, not a really large community and tough to
Right.
fundraise and all that.
Right, right. Especially, yeah, given the religious significance, because as we think about the alternative history, had it been put on the Oberlin campus in today's world, I could just see it being like administrative offices on the interior, with just the facade left outside,
Yeah,
which is also, it's like, oh, what's the real purpose of this? How are we fully appreciating it? Um,
right, right.
so getting back to a few questions, Jim, and this kind of ties into the topic of world exhibitions and world expos. So Jim Mockford says that he attended the Shanghai Expo back in 2010, and it was just fantastic. What incredible spectacle, a lot of fun to attend. Um, so I'm not sure if you're keeping up on like world expos in the works that are coming up, or plans for the future that might have like China components. But especially since we're now in a post-pandemic world, we've got new frames of reference of looking at expos that have international exhibits. How would you, are you aware of any expos or exhibits coming up uh, down in the future that might have China components, and what are your thoughts on that? What would
I don't. You know, that's a really great question. I just sort of I randomly know that they're planning one, I think in Osaka. There was a big
yes,
one in 1970, the big expo in Osaka that they're kind of rebooting. Um that I'm not sure when that's scheduled to occur, but yeah, I really don't know what's happening in the US or in China as far as exhibitions, but you know they've obviously popped up again and again over the years. You know, and certainly lots of fun.
right.
Yeah,
Yeah, the one in Osaka, I think it's planned for this year. I don't
this
know
year. Okay,
exactly when.
okay.
I was in Japan in October and
Mhm.
saw tons of advertising getting ready for it, gearing up for it.
Right.
And I also saw an announcement seeking um, Americans to work in the American exhibit hall who
Wow.
are bilingual, or not had knowledge of Japanese, who could be interpreters, English language interpreters, and things like that.
Would you have to dress in your colorful native garb
Yeah, I
as an
don't
American,
know,
cowboy
and
hat,
often
something
like,
like that?
right, So I didn't read the requirements of what the job would entail on the announcement. I saw they were wanting kind of young, energetic Americans. So I'm presuming it would be like long hours and complex things you would be encountering. Um, oh, let's see. Speaking of exhibitions, yeah, Jeff Kinkley mentioned, yeah, back in 2000, or excuse me, back in 1905, there was the Lewis and Clark exhibition in Portland. I'd be interested to know if there was a like an Oriental um, component to that.
Hmm. That's it. Yeah. Good
Uh,
question. Don't know about that
let's
one.
see. Kind of not related to your talk, Kevin, but one of our audience members who is unfamiliar with you, she was curious to know. Um, uh, Do you read or speak Chinese? What's your knowledge of like Chinese language?
Yeah, yeah. So I lived in Taiwan for about 7 years. I studied Chinese at the Taiwan Normal Language Institute. Came back, continued to studied classical Chinese. Continued to study Chinese at the university level. Um, I studied Japanese as well. And then as part of my uh, research for my dissertation, I studied Manchu language, which was really fascinating. Opportunity in Portland actually to study with Stephen Wadley at PSU, who kind of specialized in Manchu and some of his work. So that's my linguistic background. Although I feel like it's certainly my spoken Chinese has deteriorated quite a bit due to lack of practice. I need to figure out something. Duolingo's not cutting it, right? So figure something out.
Well,
Yeah,
thank you for that.
sure.
Um, Looks like not too many other questions here. Anyone else out there have questions? Happy to entertain those. Please type those in the Q&A
Happy
box.
to tell you more about Oberlin, the Allen Museum. We've got a wonderful museum,
Sure.
wonderful
Oh,
collection.
before you do that, one more question just popped up. Gretchen writes, I spent the day at the large Tibetan Buddhist temple complex in Beijing. Um, at a past trip she had. I had the sense that it was there because of a connection between one of the Manchu emperors and Tibet. So, are you able to elaborate anything on the Tibetan Buddhist temple in Beijing?
I'm laughing because that's what I wrote my dissertation on.
Oh, okay, okay.
The Yonghogong, the so-called Lama temple in Beijing, and in the sources, there's actually a link to my dissertation. If you have trouble sleeping at night and you want something to read, please take a look at that. But that'll give you all more information than you ever wanted to know about the Lama temple in Beijing, the Yonghogong. It was, and give you a real brief kind of elevator pitch version of this. It was originally the mansion, the princely mansion of the Yongzheng emperor before he became the emperor. He was a prince. He became the emperor. That's where the Qianlong emperor, his son, was born, right? The Qianlong emperor that we were talking about. He was born at that site. But there was a tradition that any place where the emperor had lived could never be lived in by somebody else, right? So they had to turn it into a temple. So it became a Tibetan Buddhist temple staffed by monks from Mongolia, ethnic Mongol monks, although the chief lamas typically were from Tibet. Um, and the Qianlong Emperor himself, I mean, I sort of highlighted the political utility of his support for Tibetan Buddhism, but he was himself a very devout practitioner. There's a lot of information about his study and practice of Tibetan Buddhism. Um, his guru, the Lama Ropé Dorje, was a really important figure at court, and a intermediary, with Tibet and the Mongols. Um, so Yonggong is a really fascinating site in that it is ostensibly Tibetan Buddhist, and there are Tibetan Buddhist elements to the architecture and certainly to the religious iconography inside the buildings. But the layout is very much like a traditional Chinese palace. So there's a lot of the synthesis of, Mongolian and Tibetan and Chinese and, cultures at that site that was really very much a part of Qing imperial you know, creation, right? Qing imperial ideology expressed in architecture. It's an amazing site. It's right on the main subway line. It's like a major subway stop, so everybody sees, Yonghwa Gong or Lama Temple on the subway. Amazing place to visit. There's a huge, I think it's 18-meter high sculpture of the Buddha of the future, Maitreya, carved out of a single giant piece of sandalwood, right? That rare, fragrant wood that was sent as a gift to the Cheleng Emperor by the king of Nepal. Um, so as you kind of make your way through the site, you get to the final massive building. You walk inside, and there's this giant gilded wooden statue of the Buddha of the future. So Yonghwa Gong, I could bore you to death talking about it. It's an amazing site.
Thank you so much. Yeah,
Yeah.
I'm sure that dissertation is a fabulous resource for those who want to dive deep into it. A
Yeah.
couple more questions here. Mary writes, did the Taiwanese nationalist government ever try to acquire the Golden Temple?
Wow. So after 49, that did not pop up in any of my research, any interest from yeah, from them. That's an interesting question. That's worth
Yeah.
looking into. Yeah, I don't know about that. Doesn't mean it didn't happen. Certainly H.H. Kong was so deeply connected with the project and with the Republican government. So yeah, that'd be interesting to pursue. Thank you for bringing that up.
Mhm. Let's see here. Oh, a question about your own travels. Have you ever visited the pavilions in Beijing, and in Lama? And if so, like when did you do that? Like what year?
Yeah, so honestly, wow, the last time I was in China was 2005. So it's been a long time. I've
Okay.
I've been back to Asia since taking this job. I've been to Korea and Japan, for various museum related trips. Um but yeah, 2005 was the last time I was in China as part of my dissertation research where I spent a lot of time in Beijing. I went up to Chengde, right? So the sites that we looked at today. A lot of those photographs are actually mine. Um, and then yeah, so
Okay.
and travel, different places in China as well. But haven't been back in a while. And given the political tensions, I'm not sure. Not sure when I'll
Right.
be when I'll be going back, but I'd love to go back again. Wonderful time. And back to Taiwan. I mean, my God, I spent so much time in Taiwan and still have friends there. What a wonderful place.
Mhm.
Love to go back.
Okay, well, thank you there. And it looks like one last comment here. Jan Vreeland writes, thank you so much, Kevin, for your presentation. We have fond memories of your past lectures in Portland.
Oh yeah.
We would love to be able to see you again whenever you're passing through. So I know
Great.
sometimes you do travel back to Portland. Is that right?
We've got family. My wife's family all live in Portland, so we're back once a year.
I see.
With some frequency. So, in fact, my wife and kids just got back from Portland last night, visiting my wife's mom. So, yeah, I'll be back. I'll look you up, Dennis and everybody.
And
Yeah, it'd be
Jan,
great to
yeah.
see you.
Great.
Yeah,
Well, thank you so much, Kevin.
sure.
Looks like we're at the time to wrap up. So thank you again, Kevin, for a fascinating talk. Always love having you speak with us. We always like to hear what's going on with your work at Oberlin College. I encourage those in the audience to check out the website of the Allen Memorial Museum at Oberlin College. Ling on our committee and I were looking at it yesterday and just floored at the amount of projects and exhibits that they have, the quality of them, and all of that we owe to Kevin's great work there. Want to remind people in the audience um, that our New Year's banquet next month will be on Sunday, the first Sunday of March or of February, February 2nd, and we'll be getting an announcement out soon about that at the location, a local Chinese restaurant. I know that seating is going to be somewhat limited, so when you do get that announcement and you want to attend, please RSVP quickly. That way we can reserve a seat for you. Um, And I do know that on February 1st, there's quite a few Chinese New Year events planned in the community. There's a big one going to be, I think, at the convention center, put on by like Chinese, a conglomerate of Chinese groups in Portland. And then Lansu Garden has some events going on, I think on the 1st and also on the 2nd of February to celebrate the Chinese New Year. So we look forward to seeing folks in February at our annual spring banquet, February 2nd.